Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Seufert, and the name of the presentation that I will be giving today is Envisioning the Post-ATT World. I'm coming to you from Austin, Texas, although I wish I was there with everyone in Paris. I want to thank the IAB for asking me to speak today. A little bit about myself before I jump into the presentation. If any of you knows who I am, it's probably because of the work I do with Mobile Dev Memo, which is a trade blog that I run that covers mobile advertising and the freemium economy design. I've also created an open source Python library called Theseus for marketing cohort analysis, and I run a consultancy called Heracles. So, brief overview of the agenda of the talk. I'll start. So today, the sort of the general focus of the discussion is on what the world of digital advertising looks like for mobile in the aftermath of Apple's app tracking transparency privacy policy. And I've written pretty extensively about that on Mobile Dev Memo. And again, if any of you have heard of me, it's probably because of the writing I've published on that topic. I'll kind of briefly touch on what I believe was a catalyst for ATT, and you know some of the broader changes that have come to digital advertising. I'll talk about the consequences of ATT, and you know some of which I believe will have been unintended. I'll talk about some of the new techniques that companies are currently working on and have been working on for many years for implementing digital advertising in a way that's sensitive to user privacy while still retaining a high level of performance and efficacy. And then I'll talk about a concept that I've written about quite a bit called the content fortress, which I believe is going to play a big part of this new reality that we now inhabit. So what was the catalyst? What has been the catalyst for much of this momentum around digital advertising privacy? Well, I believe it's been Apple. I believe Apple has catalyzed most of these changes, and in the cases where other companies have followed suit or have announced that they will follow suit at some point in the future, I believe they were just reacting to things that Apple has done, right? So really, it all kind of traces back to intelligent tracking prevention, or ITP, which was announced or released or unveiled or unleashed on the world by Apple in 2017. Obviously, ATT followed in 2021, and Private Relay was introduced with iOS 15 just recently, just a few months ago. But all these are Apple are Apple's brainchildren, right? These are products or features or concepts that Apple produced, and so I believe Apple has led the charge with sort of reining in some of the excesses of digital advertising with respect to privacy, but also of using privacy as kind of a competitive cudgel. And one more privacy feature that Apple has launched also in iOS 15 was mail privacy protection. So hide my mail, hide my email. Well, with respect to ATT specifically, I mean, I think we all have some sense of the competitive consequence of that, right? Like what the competitive result was of that, just in terms of advertising revenues, right? And I'm sure some high proportion of the audience has seen this chart. This was from the Financial Times, but in the wake of ATT, Apple's own ad network revenues increased pretty dramatically. Now there are some issues with this data, and I've kind of talked about this chart specifically on Mobile Dev Memo, but directionally I think it's probably it probably is reliable in the sense that yes, Apple did gain market share from ATT as a result of ATT, and so ATT was in part motivated by competitive impulses. I don't think it was just pure beneficence on the part of Apple in terms of protecting consumers. I think there was also there was also some some obvious kind of commercial motivations here. And, it's not only that Apple gained, but other companies, lost. Other companies were impaired by this. Because at least in the short run, it's probably, it's probably a dollar for a dollar, right? It's probably, it's a closed market, and money flows out of one company and flows into another company. Snap being one of those companies. In Q3, in this most recent earnings season, Snap's announced that they had some pretty considerable challenges with navigating ATT, and as a result, they lost a quarter of their market cap in a single day. After kind of acknowledging those challenges. Now, I think this is partly because Snap did a very poor job of managing investor expectations going into ATT, and they kind of, Evan Spiegel spent a lot of time talking about how ATT was a very good thing and they were happy that Apple was doing it. Maybe that's true, but they also could have acknowledged, done a better job of acknowledging, or a sort of more thorough job of acknowledging that, this was going to change, their own business. And it was going to impair their existing advertising business, and they were going to have to invest a lot of money into re-architecting their advertising business to align with ATT. And it turns out, and what they stated in the earnings call, was that they were having a difficult time navigating that change. It was actually a more substantive change than they had predicted. And ultimately, I think the IDFA had to go. At some point, it was going to need to be retired and sunset. I wrote a piece a couple months ago called the IDFA, actually more than a year ago, called "The IDFA is the hydrocarbon of the mobile advertising ecosystem." And what I meant by that was that it created negative externalities that, these advertising networks didn't necessarily have to confront, right? It deteriorated consumer trust in the advertising ecosystem and the internet more broadly. People don't like the idea that they're being followed around, and they don't like the idea that their interactions are being observed by companies that they have no direct relationship with. And that's problematic for a lot of consumers. And that's exactly how the advertising ecosystem operated. And so it was, the IDFA served a purpose, and but it had sort of outgrown that purpose. The sort of negative consequences of the IDFA were becoming fairly severe. And so I think it was time for the IDFA to be retired. I don't agree with the way that Apple did it. And I don't agree with, a lot of the ways that ATT has been implemented, that I believe punish a lot of ad networks sort of unnecessarily. But nonetheless, I do believe that the IDFA did need to be retired because it was being abused. It was being abused by data brokers and sort of ad tech middlemen that were just collecting data that they really had no sort of credible claim to. But ATT could have been implemented in a way that gave consumers the ability to opt into that kind of data collection without impairing sort of very severely the entire ecosystem, right? So I tweeted this. I made this mock-up of an ATT prompt that I felt like was more evocative of the actual use case of the IDFA, and I published it on Twitter a long time ago, or in last February, or this February. And I said, look, what if you just framed the question differently? If you didn't talk about tracking you across other apps and websites, but you actually just sort of led into the decision with sort of an acknowledgement of what the IDFA facilitates, right? So allow this app to personalize the advertising that you see, because that's what happens. That's what the IDFA was used for when it wasn't abused, right? When it was used in sort of the way that it was designed to be used, then that's what it allowed to happen, was that advertising got personalized at the user level, which I don't think anybody really would object to. What they object to is their data being sort of transmitted around between companies that they have no direct relationship with without their permission, right? But if I opt into that, I say, okay, well, if you're going to send this data back to a company that is the one that serves ads to me, then maybe I'm okay with that, because then I know that the ads that I see will be personalized to my tastes and my behaviors and my predilections, and they won't be random, right? Because I think there is one thing that people hate much more than advertising, and it's irrelevant advertising. But ATT happened, right? I think it's probably not very productive to endlessly litigate ATT. It happened, and we have to sort of adapt to this new world. But there have been some consequences to ATT, and I think it's important to recognize those, because I think that helps to inform any sort of path forward. And I'll get to this in a second, but one of the consequences of this was what I call the content fortress, right? So you've created a situation where it's very beneficial for these large platforms to subsume a lot of the content interactions that they used to facilitate via ads onto the platforms themselves. And the canonical example of this, and again, I'm going to get into in a minute, is Facebook Shops, right? So Facebook Shops became a platform for hosting shops, and not, whereas Facebook previously in the kind of within the sort of shopping workflow, it was the discovery mechanism. It allowed people to discover things they wanted to buy, but they clicked the ad and they left Facebook and they went to the sort of final destination. And in that way, Facebook served as a kind of typical walled garden, right? So they served the ads, they monetized your eyeballs, your engagement, but the transaction happened offsite. Well, that's changing. And in reaction to ATT, Facebook is pulling that transaction onto its platform, because if the transaction happens on its platform, they host that transaction, then that data is first party to them. Because ATT ultimately, the crux of ATT is ultimately that first party data is fair game for use in ads targeting, and third party data is not. You can't transfer you can't transfer user data from a first party context to a third party context to be used in ads targeting. So that data either remains within the first party context, or it just sort of returns to the ether. But it can't be packaged up and sent off to third party context for use in ad targeting. Well, then that just creates a lot of incentive to push all of these interactions and all these transactions into the first party context, because then that data is sort of available to be used in ads targeting. And so I think, if we think about the sort of models that are allowed under, ATT, or that were allowed pre-ATT and pre-ITP, well, it was, the data created on within closed ecosystems, or, data that was created on the open web or the open app ecosystem, that was all sort of fair game for use in ads targeting. Well, now that's not the case, right? Only the data that will be produced within the context of these first party or sort of closed ecosystems / quote unquote walled gardens, only that data will be, usable for ads targeting. And the data that's created on the open web / app ecosystem won't be. And so, well, what does that incentivize? That just incentivizes developers to sort of align and become dependent on these walled gardens and these closed ecosystems, right? So, this probably creates like bigger centers of gravity for these very large platforms, and removes the opportunity for companies to sort of launch, without any sort of dependencies on those. And we've seen the consequences of this. We've been seeing it since ATT was announced. There's just been a flurry of M&A activity, of consolidation and especially in the mobile advertising space, because these companies recognize that. So they're just snapping up. So you've got content companies buying ad tech, and you've got ad tech companies buying content, because they need to pair the two together to create what I call the content fortress. And again, I'm going to get into that later in the presentation. And the other consequence is that basically everything becomes an ad network. I wrote a piece about this a few weeks ago called "Everything Becomes an Ad Network," or "Everything is Becoming an Ad Network." The reason for that is you've got all these companies that have a lot of first-party data that they couldn't really monetize before, because Facebook and Google stole all the advertising growth. All the digital advertising growth went to Facebook and Google. There was I think the most recent data on this was from 2017 or something, but still it was Facebook and Google had accounted for 89% of the digital advertising revenue growth. So they were taking all the growth. There was no way to edge your way in, because they had that sort of nexus of engagement. Well, that nexus of engagement is only as good now as it can produce the transactions that it used to facilitate on the platform. And so where it can't, there's an opportunity for these other sort of like, these other sort of content portals to pair advertising with their first party data and sell ads against it, right? And advertising is a really attractive business because it's very high margin. Okay, so what are some of the techniques that companies are undertaking to sort of preserve privacy while still, while still kind of unlocking the sort of power of advertising and kind of preserving the efficacy of their own advertising systems. Well, taking a step back, there's kind of two models of digital advertising targeting. The first is signal specific, right? So signal specific advertising targeting means that specific contexts are targeted with ads, and explicit intent of the current state of the user is captured, right? And I think that the canonical example here is just contextual advertising. So users on site A, or they're in app A, and if they're on app A, they probably like topic 1, and so we'll test ads for topic 1 on site A or app A, and if they work, then we'll continue to show those ads. If they don't, we'll try something else. And the second model is hub and spoke, right? So user profiles are built from historical data, but the data is moved from the advertiser back to the ad platform, right? So there's kind of a feedback loop. Ads are shown on the ad platform. The ad clicks out to some external destination. The user interacts with that external destination. The data is sent back to the ad platform, which is the hub, right? And all the hub really does is just aggregate all that data and build historical profiles of users, behavioral profiles of users using that historical data. And those behavioral profiles behavioral profiles of the users are used to target ads to that user, right? And so intent is preempted, right? So I preempt your intent. I serve you an ad for something before you even know that you want it. That's how this is described a lot of the times. But actually, I'm serving you an ad based on I'm serving you an ad from some selection of ads that are currently available to show to you based on what I believe you have the highest likelihood of interacting with, right? That you have the highest likelihood of clicking on, but ultimately then going to that destination and making a purchase, right? Because that's the sort of most valuable sort of feedback data for ads targeting is purchases, right? So I'm predicting your proclivity to engage and to transact, and instead of using sort of some immediate intent like a search, right, or a context, I'm actually using your behavior, historical behaviors, to predict the probability that you'll interact with some ad and then ultimately make a purchase, right? And the hub and spoke model becomes non-viable with ATT, right? Because the hub and spoke model is completely dependent on that transfer of data from a third-party context to a first-party context. And so this is just a simple diagram that I made. I wrote a post a couple months ago, kind of prior to ATT, where I predicted that Facebook would suffer a 7% revenue headwind as a result of ATT. And so I mapped out this kind of feedback loop. And I think it turns out that was optimistic, 7%. I think it actually ended up being much higher than 7%, probably closer to 12 or 13%. I did some analysis, kind of after the Q3 earnings, but nonetheless, this diagram kind of shows the path that users take and their data takes, in sort of service of building these behavioral profiles. Okay, so what are the privacy sensitive? What are forms of privacy sensitive targeting? What are smart ad tech companies investing into right now? Well, one approach is differential privacy, right? So the idea here is that we don't build profiles of users, but we put users into groups based on their behaviors, based on their observed behaviors. And those groups are so large that we can't sort of intuit the presence of any given user based on group level metrics, like based on the group level mean value of transaction size or engagement time or whatever the case might be. We wouldn't be able to know, because the group's large enough that we wouldn't be able to know that user A was present in the group or not present in the group. And for that reason, we wouldn't be able to know that user A did something or they did not do something. And so it kind of protects the privacy of the individual members while allowing them to contribute to some sort of like measurable, sort of outcome that we can attach to the campaign and use as a basis for measuring its performance. Another approach is on-device processing, right? So instead of the hub and spoke model where the hub shows the ad clicks to an external destination, and then the data flows back from the external destination back to the hub, what we do is we push all of the machinery for showing the ad onto the device, right? And so the device becomes the hub. The device contains the model that kind of determines which ad gets shown. So instead of the data flowing back from, well, the data flows back from the external site to the hub. But before that, the hub pushes its entire sort of model basically onto the device. And then when an ad, becomes available on the device in the app or on the website, the sort of the targeting mechanics happen on the device, right? Or the sort of targeting process happens on the device because the model's been pushed onto the device. So the device uses all the machinery that the hub has, which has been pushed onto the device to determine which ad is most appropriate to show that user. And then the ad gets shown, and then basically only the outcome is sent back, right? Now, a lot of times this is paired with a technique called federated learning, which is where, the model is sent to the device, as I just described, but that outcome that impacts the sort of model coefficients, right? So you've tuned a model. The model is, if it's an online model, it's sort of constantly being updated with the priors are being constantly updated. And so if that user single interaction or that user single sort of like yes, no binary success metric or whatever, the kind of the outcome, whatever outcome you're measuring, that changes those model parameters, and that the change to the model parameters actually gets sent back to the hub, right? To that sort of model owner. And then when you're doing that sort of at internet scale, you're constantly sort of receiving these model parameters, and you're trying to reconcile that with the kind of the actual sort of the centralized model. So the centralized model is just receiving sort of new updates to the parameters and just reconciling that and sort of balancing that, and then sending that back out to all the spokes, right? Okay, so to end, I'll just walk through this idea of the content fortress, which is this concept that I've come up with, which I believe is ultimately what's going to be the kind of sort of resounding operating model post ATT for the biggest platforms, right? So the idea here is, and I described it before, and I'll just kind of briefly recapitulate, but the idea is that instead of being the hub and spoke, right, instead of having this data be transferring between contexts, I'm just gonna try to pull all the context into my own platform, right? And then I own the data, and I can use the data to target ads on my own platform to my heart's content. And I originally wrote about this in a piece called "The Profound Unintended Consequences of ATT: Content Fortresses." So, and the way I defined a content fortress or described a content fortress is any platform or portfolio of products supported by a rich advertising ecosystem serving owned and operated inventory using only first-party data, right? So only first-party data is used. All of the transactions, all of the interactions happen within the context of the content fortress, and so therefore all that data is fair game for ads targeting. Well, how is that? How is that taking shape, right? Well, I think one interesting way is Facebook Shops, right? And you've got Shop Pay, which is Shopify's payment product, kind of becoming the core product of the company, right? It's the pipes to support these content fortresses. It's not the hosting capability for an independent storefront, because again, this sort of path to launching a successful storefront is usually mostly predicated on being able to advertise the products on a big platform like Facebook. Well, if that's not the case, Shop Pay can still sort of consolidate all that payment data and facilitate those payments in a simple way, but on the platforms that now are going to become these content fortresses. And so what Shopify did was it made Shop Pay available. Shop Pay used to be kind of only available to Shopify merchants, right? Well, what they did was they said, well, now we're going to allow Facebook and Google to use Shop Pay in their own environments, even for companies that are, not Shopify merchants that want to sell on Facebook or Google, right? So we're going to open up Shop Pay to non-Shopify clients, right? Non-Shopify retailers on the Facebook and Google platforms, because we see where this is headed, right? We need, that's the way that we're going to be able to participate in this ecosystem now. Another example is TikTok made a product called Jumps, right? So Jumps are instant apps, basically. You build an app and you run it exclusively on TikTok, right? So it's a mini app that you launch on TikTok, right? And the idea here is, well, if it's harder to advertise my app, which exists in the App Store, on TikTok, then I'll just go to TikTok. And all the engagement that happens on TikTok creates data artifacts that TikTok can use to target ads going forward. TikTok also has launched TikTok Shopping, right? So very similar to Facebook Shops. It's this same exact sort of mechanics. And Twitter has done the same. They've launched Twitter Shopping. So, basically every social product is becoming a shopping product, because all of these retailers are going to have to move there. It's not going to be viable to sort of use these platforms to drive traffic through paid ads. And so they've got to move onto the platforms and sell directly there, so that when those transactions do happen, the platforms can ingest that data and use that data to improve the campaigns of those retailers. Shopify has also moved into selling products within Spotify, right? So go to the social product, allow retailers to sell there, or allow artists to sell there, instead of, trying to get that, instead of relying on their ability to drive user acquisition through paid ads on those platforms. Facebook has sort of, revamping its instant articles product, which is kind of the first implementation, or the original implementation maybe, of the content fortress, approach, which is that you take these content interactions and you move them onto the platform, right? And that was instant articles. And Instagram's also testing ads in its shop tab, right? So again, this is just bringing that advertising component into the sort of on platform content interaction. So thank you to the IAB for having me today. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope we meet in person someday.